I think, considered to be one of the most famous arguments there is, and it's called, by Kant, it's called the ontological argument. Ontos means, in Greek, the idea of, or the definition, really, of the thing. And so it's the logic of the definition. So ontological. Kant broke the arguments for the existence of God up into three groups. The ontological arguments, which this one is the prime example of it. The cosmological arguments, cosmos, the universe. You look at the cosmos, you see everything that's going on, and then the logic follows from that. So cause and effect, basically. And so, basically the cosmological argument is you see all this stuff, everything's happening, stuff moves, but there had to be something that moved that, and there had to be something that moved that, et cetera, but there had to be a first mover, which of course is Aristotle, and that first mover would be God. So it's proof for the existence of God because God is the unmoved mover, essentially. And then there's the third group of arguments, which is the teleological arguments, the idea of the design. The one we're most familiar with is take a look at the eye. The eye is so complex and everything, without a creator designing that, there's no way that could have evolved that way. You don't see people around with half eyes and stuff like that. It doesn't work. So the design argument is the teleological one. But this one is the ontological, or the idea from, or the definition of God. And so he starts off, truly there is a God, although the fool hath said in his heart there is no God. That's a biblical quote. The fool has said in his heart there is no God. By the way, when we get to Thomas Hobbes, it's kind of fun. He uses that line, but he says, the fool has said in his heart there is no justice. So he plays, he's doing a pun with that line. But in any case, and so, Lord, do thou, who dost give understanding, remember, he's writing this in Latin, so all this fancy jargon is the translator. And so, Lord, do thou, who dost give understanding to faith, give me, so far as thou knowest it to be profitable, to understand that thou art as we believe, and that thou art that which we believe. And indeed, we believe that thou art a being, and here we go, this is the quote here, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Something important here, he's not saying you're the greatest thing, all the different people that work for President Trump say to him, maybe I shouldn't say stuff like that, but this is, sorry, I'm just trying to be contemporary and relevant,
That was funny.
Okay. I just don't want to get shot, that's, sorry.
Well, then go jump on the other side.
So, what's different here is he's not saying God is the greatest thing. He's saying that there's nothing greater. There's nothing greater. So this is actually referred to as the via negativa, the negative way. You're not saying this is what God is. I remember once I was in cars shopping, and at the cashier I saw the newspaper rag that was that had a picture of heaven, and it said the Hubble telescope has found heaven out in space, and it was a bunch of stars, but it was shaped kind of like the Acropolis in Athens. It was just hilarious. I almost bought it just for that. But then I realized, I can make that picture myself. I don't need to buy that one. But no, he's not saying what God is. He's saying that there's nothing greater thou art a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, oh, by the way, who's the fool that he's talking about? I love that question. Who's the fool? My own opinion is that he's had doubts himself. I mean, anyone that's studied, theology, or any of this stuff, you hear the stuff when you're a kid. Everyone says God is great, God is this, and all that. And you get to a certain age where you think, none of that can be true. You're loaded with doubt. So the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So I think he's writing this to persuade himself about the existence of God. It's his attempt theologically to convince himself. But at any rate, this very fool, when he hears of this being of which I speak, a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears. So that's your first task with this argument, is understanding what on earth is he meaning by saying that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And I like thinking, well, pick something easy. A perfect example for me is pizza. Pizza exists, right? Everybody, you all have experience with pizza? I personally think I have a couple DiGiorno's in the freezer at home.
Yeah.
Although, my own preference here, I've been buying pizza from Pizza Man in Eagle River since I moved here in 1987, and I still think they're the best pizza in the local area. I know a lot of people swear by the Moose's Tooth, and I have to admit, I've eaten lots of pizza from the Moose's Tooth. Whenever the philosophy department has a thing, we buy pizzas, like 20 of them, from the Moose's Tooth, and they put the weirdest things on those pizzas. Pizza Man is good. They put just real pizza stuff on the pizzas. None of this odd, dead ears from a goat, or whatever.
Do you live in Eagle River?
Yeah.
That's why it's pizza.
But so there are pizzas.
Yeah, east side of small little pizza. Hands
Pizzas really exist. There's a pizza that exists right now. And in fact, here's my question. Is there a largest pizza in Anchorage right now? Smallest pizza too. Tastiest pizza, moldiest pizza. I imagine, we can find somebody's got a moldy pizza in their fridge.
It's possible.
Right? So there's lots of different kinds of pizza, but there is a largest pizza in Anchorage right now, even though we don't know which one it is. And in fact, it might not be the largest for long, because it's being served right now at Moose's Tooth, and people are starting to eat it already, so it already lost its status as the largest pizza. Is there a largest pizza in the world?
Probably.
Has to be, right? Is there a largest pizza in the universe?
We don't know.
That's a good reason.
Well, but if there's one on the Earth,
Yeah, that
and
could be
there
the
aren't
one.
any anywhere else, then that would have to be the largest.
Yes.
It's kind of a mathematical thing, right? If you have the idea that there are
Let's call it a
pizzas,
theory.
okay, there are pizzas, and there actually has to be an existing one. So there has to be a largest. Well, there are beings in the world, and by definition, now, and this is, of course, this might, I suppose this is the biggest weakness, if you think of it this way, is what Anselm is giving us as the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. It's not saying it's human, it's not saying it's conscious, not saying anything else, just this, right? And so by definition, since there are beings, that than which nothing greater can be conceived must exist. Now, what is it? of course, you might want to say, the universe is the largest thing, at least that we can observe, right? I mean, we've got all kinds of telescopes now that are telling us just how humongous. It's just absolutely outrageous. I mean, remember, at this time they were thinking, there's the stars, it's, not too far away, etc. Little lights, up in some kind of screen going around, whatever they were thinking, right? But nonetheless, they're right about saying that if by definition you're saying that God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived, and you can understand that, right? I mean, you can get into complexity here on, well, what does that entail, right? Because I can think of all kinds of things, like a unicorn, I suppose, right? I can think of a unicorn, and strictly speaking, what we know we mean by that, they don't exist. They're a mythical beast. They don't really exist. And so I can think of a unicorn. I can think of the greatest unicorn. But that doesn't mean that the greatest unicorn exists. Agreed. No problem, right? If you follow this out, there's another monk that gets involved and argues, Ganilian, I think his name is, and he argues that, well, what if there's a golden island? I can think of a golden island, but just because I can think of it doesn't mean that it exists. Well, of course, no problem. Yeah, there are islands. In fact, there's the largest island. I think by definition, Greenland is the largest island, because if you go to Australia, Australia is not considered an island, it's called a continent, right? It's just our own way of creating a category, and Australia's in continents and Greenland's an island, and not yet a property of the United States, even though well, let me get off of that. However, using the concept of all these things that we know don't exist doesn't actually prove that the argument fails, because God doesn't have any other characteristics that entails something that doesn't exist. It's just that than which nothing greater can be thought. And there are things, and by definition, God is the greatest, or that than which nothing greater can be thought. So therefore, God exists. There's your argument. Of course, now you have to fill in, what do you mean by God? Is Jesus God? Is Allah God? Zeus? Zeus, Jesus, Teus? What would you call God, right? Temu. Of course, you've got different gods there, and they're in competition almost with one another, kind of like the Greek and the Roman, hierarchies of gods, right? Temu has a specific domain, as opposed to Aten and Isis. Isis is my favorite. I don't know.
Hard to say in context.
And then you have Israel, Ra, God the Most High. Is temple of Ra, the Most High, El, God, right? So Israel, woo, temple of the Most High God, woo. That's one interpretation of what that means. Right? It's kind of neat.
What is Ra?
Ra is like Ramesses. Ramesses is the one who is the like the voice of Ra, right? So the Pharaoh Ramesses was, and there were bunches of them. There's 1, 2, 3 Ramesses speaking for Ra, right? So they have a hierarchy. Although, of course, remember Akhenaten changed all of that, at least for about 15 years, and focused on just Aten, the sun god. But then he died or got killed, right, for totally wrecking the economy of Egypt. etc. So here's your argument. Basically, that's, there's lots more. God cannot be conceived not to exist. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. That which can be conceived not to exist isn't God. Does this argument give you a headache?
If it can be conceived, then that is like